A county truck rolled onto my gravel drive before sunrise, and two inspectors started photographing my remote cabin without knocking. Behind them, Linda Parker stood beside her white SUV, smiling while her HOA complaint sat clipped to a yellow violation folder. She had reported my cabin as illegal, unsafe, and built inside Cedar Ridge Estate's control territory. My porch, my wood pill. The inspector kept his eyes on the survey marker while the morning sun pushed through the pines. Frost melted from the grass in thin, silver lines. Linda walked closer, her boots crunching over gravel. "It is just an old marker," she said. Nobody answered her. The inspector brushed more dirt away from the metal cap. Numbers circled the top edge. A state survey code sat in the center. He copied everything into his notebook. The second inspector stepped beside him and took photographs from 3 different angles. Camera shutters clicked through the cold air. Linda folded her arms. The confidence she wore earlier looked less comfortable now. I went back inside the cabin and carried out a long cardboard tube. The original survey rested inside. I kept it sealed because mountain weather destroys paper faster than people expect. The inspector spread the document across the hood of his truck. Wind tried to lift one corner. He held it flat and compared the map to the marker. Then he compared it again. His pen stopped moving. That caught my attention. A small silence settled over the clearing. Even the birds seemed quieter. Linda pulled out her phone. "This does not change anything," she said. "The HOA boundary has already been established." The inspector looked up. "According to which survey?" Linda hesitated for half a second. It was the first uncertain movement I had seen from her all morning. She opened a file on her phone and showed him a digital map. The inspector studied it. Then he looked back at my survey. The 2 documents did not match. Not exactly. Not even close in one section near the Ridge Road. The second inspector noticed it too. He pointed toward a line on the map, then toward the trees downhill. Neither man spoke immediately. That made the difference feel bigger. A cold breeze carried the smell of pine sap across the clearing. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a logging truck engine echoed through the mountains. Linda kept talking. The inspectors kept looking at the maps. One of them finally asked a simple question. "Who prepared this HOA survey?" Linda named an engineering company. The inspector wrote it down. Then he asked another question. "How old is it?" Linda checked her phone. "About 11 years. The inspector nodded slowly. He returned his attention to the original state survey spread across the truck hood. My document was older, much older, but state boundary records tend to outlive subdivisions. That was why surveyors trust them. The second inspector followed the line from the marker to a point farther down the mountain. Then he stopped. "Where does Cedar Ridge Road actually begin?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Linda looked downhill toward the entrance gate hidden among the trees. The inspector noticed. So did I. He drew a circle around a section of the survey and photographed it. Then he stood up and closed his notebook. "I need to verify something with county records." Linda forced a smile. "This is still about the cabin, correct?" The inspector slid the survey back into the tube and handed it to me. His expression stayed neutral. "Not anymore." Then he asked for the exact location of the HOA entrance gate. The inspectors left my cabin just before noon and headed downhill toward the Cedar Ridge entrance. Their trucks disappeared through the pines, throwing dust into the sunlight. Linda climbed into her SUV without another word. The smile she arrived with never came back. By afternoon, the mountain felt strangely quiet. Wind moved through the trees. A woodpecker hammered somewhere beyond the ridge. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched clouds drift over the valley below. Then my phone rang. It was the lead inspector. His voice sounded different, more focused. "We found something at the gate." That was all he said before ending the call. An hour later, I drove down the mountain. Cedar Ridge looked exactly as it always had. Stone entrance columns, decorative fencing, security cameras, fresh landscaping. Residents walked dogs along the sidewalks. Golf carts rolled through the neighborhood streets. Everything looked polished, permanent. The inspectors were parked beside the entrance gate. Orange survey flags had appeared around the property line. That immediately caught my attention. Survey flags never show up unless somebody wants precise answers. The lead inspector stood beside a tripod-mounted instrument aimed toward the woods. Another man had joined them. Gray beard, reflective vest, state survey badge. He introduced himself and immediately asked to see my original survey again. I handed him the tube. He studied the documents for several minutes without speaking. Then he compared coordinates from my map against a digital database on his tablet. His fingers stopped moving across the screen. The state surveyor looked toward the entrance gate, then toward the stone columns, then toward the decorative fence running beside the road. His expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. Like he had finally found something he expected to see. Linda arrived moments later. She stepped out of her SUV carrying a folder thick enough to hold years of HOA records. Several board members followed behind her. Nobody looked relaxed. The state surveyor walked toward one of the stone columns. He placed a measuring rod against the edge and checked another coordinate. Then another. The inspectors watched quietly. Residents started gathering nearby. A few pulled out their phones. News travels fast in mountain communities, especially when county vehicles appear. The state surveyor finally lowered his equipment. "I need access to your development records," he said to Linda. She handed him the folder. He flipped through the pages while standing beside the gate. Wind rattled nearby pine branches. A loose HOA banner snapped against a post. The surveyor stopped on one page and frowned. Then he flipped backward, then forward again. He compared something in the folder against the coordinates on his tablet. The lead inspector leaned over to look. Neither man said anything. That silence stretched longer than any argument could have. One of the HOA board members shifted, nervously beside the sidewalk. A resident stopped walking his dog and stayed to watch. The surveyor closed the folder and handed it back. "Where did this boundary map come from?" Linda named an engineering company, the same one she mentioned earlier. The surveyor nodded slowly. Then he looked toward the road disappearing through the trees. "I would like to see the original filing." Linda's face tightened. The lead inspector glanced at me briefly before returning to his notes. The atmosphere around the entrance had completely changed. This was no longer about a cabin. It was no longer about a complaint. The question had become much larger. Then the surveyor pointed toward the HOA gatehouse. The state surveyor walked directly toward the gatehouse while everyone else followed behind. Gravel crunched under dozens of feet. The late afternoon sun reflected from the windows of the small stone building beside the entrance. Security cameras watched the road from metal poles. Decorative lanterns lined the sidewalk. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked permanent. The surveyor stopped beside the corner of the gatehouse and checked another coordinate on his tablet. Then he compared it against the survey marker data collected earlier that morning. The lead inspector leaned over his shoulder. Neither man spoke. Linda stood several yards away holding her folder against her chest. A light breeze moved through the pine trees above us. Residents continued gathering along the entrance road. Some stood beside golf carts. Others remained on sidewalks pretending not to watch. Nobody was leaving. The surveyor measured another point near the edge of the parking area, then another beside the decorative stone wall. Orange survey flags appeared one by one, small pieces of plastic, bright and impossible to ignore. Each new flag changed the mood. The lead inspector eventually asked for access to the gatehouse records. Linda unlocked the door herself. The interior smelled like coffee, printer toner, and fresh paint. Surveillance monitors covered one wall. Community notices covered another. The surveyor spread several documents across a desk beneath fluorescent lights. He compared coordinates, property descriptions, filing references. Every few minutes he circled another item with a red pen. I remained near the doorway, watching, listening. The room felt smaller each minute. Linda tried to explain the development history. The surveyor listened politely, then returned to the documents. That pattern repeated several times. Outside, a delivery truck stopped at the gate and waited. Nobody moved to open it. The driver eventually turned off the engine and joined the crowd. Nearly everyone understood something unusual was happening. They just did not know what. An hour passed, then another. Shadows stretched across the entrance road. The surveyor finally stood and carried the documents outside. The crowd immediately went quiet. He placed the papers on the hood of the county truck. The lead inspector joined him. Together, they reviewed a filing map from the original Cedar Ridge development package. I noticed one detail immediately. A section near the entrance had been highlighted. The surveyor pointed toward it, then toward the gatehouse, then toward the stone columns. Linda stepped forward. "What exactly are you saying?" The surveyor remained calm. "I am saying I need the original county filing." Linda frowned. "That is the original filing." The surveyor shook his head. "No, that is a copy." Silence followed. Even the wind seemed to disappear. One of the HOA board members lowered his eyes. Another looked toward the road. The lead inspector wrote something into his notebook. Then the surveyor revealed the part that changed everything. The county database listed a different reference number for the first boundary submission. Not revised. Different. Completely different. Linda blinked twice. Her confidence slipped for the first time all day. The crowd began whispering. Residents exchanged confused looks. The delivery driver folded his arms and stayed where he was. The surveyor closed the folder and slid it back toward Linda. I need to see the filing that came before this one. Then he asked who authorized the boundary revision. Nobody answered the surveyor's question right away. The crowd near the entrance road became unusually still. Pine branches swayed above the stone columns. A loose HOA banner snapped against a pole. Linda looked down at the folder in her hands as if the answer might be hiding between the pages. One of the board members cleared his throat. Another stared toward the gatehouse windows. The surveyor waited. He did not rush. People who work with land records learn patience early. Eventually, an older board member stepped forward. His name was Robert Gaines. I had seen him around Cedar Ridge for years. Retired banker. Quiet. Always standing one step behind whoever happened to be HOA president at the time. The revision happened before Linda joined the board, he said. The surveyor wrote the name down. Who approved it? Robert hesitated. I would need to check old meeting records. The lead inspector immediately asked where those records were stored. Robert pointed toward a filing room inside the community clubhouse. The surveyor nodded once. Then he requested access. By then the sun had dropped lower over the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the entrance road. Residents slowly followed the county vehicles toward the clubhouse parking lot. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Inside, the clubhouse smelled like carpet cleaner, coffee, and polished wood. Framed photographs lined the walls. Community events. Holiday parties. Ribbon cuttings. Years of HOA history. The filing room sat near the back office. Metal cabinets filled one wall from floor to ceiling. Robert unlocked the door. The surveyor immediately began searching through archived meeting minutes and development files. Paper rustled. Cabinet drawers opened and closed. The room remained quiet except for the sound of pages turning. Linda stood near the doorway with her arms folded. She barely spoke. That alone told me how much the situation had changed. 2 days earlier, she had been trying to shut down my cabin. Now county officials were reviewing decades of HOA records. Hours passed. Residents drifted in and out of the hallway. Some brought coffee. Others whispered among themselves. The lead inspector continued taking notes. Then just before sunset, the surveyor found something. He removed a thin binder from the bottom drawer of a cabinet and opened it on the table. The room went silent. A yellow divider labeled boundary adjustment sat inside. Several signatures appeared on the first page. Meeting approvals followed. Then engineering correspondence. The surveyor turned another page and stopped. His finger rested on a handwritten note attached to a revised boundary exhibit. He read it once. Then again. The lead inspector stepped closer. Robert leaned over the table. Even Linda moved nearer. The note referenced an unresolved conflict involving original state survey markers. My attention locked onto those words immediately. The surveyor carefully removed the page and placed it beside the earlier documents. More references followed. Marker discrepancies. Verification delays. Pending review recommendations. Every page suggested the same thing. Questions had existed long before the revision was approved. Questions nobody fully resolved. Outside, evening wind moved through the pines. The clubhouse windows reflected the last orange light of the day. The surveyor closed the binder and looked directly at the lead inspector. I need the state archive file. Then he read a reference number none of us had ever seen before. The reference number followed me all the way home. Night had settled over the mountain by the time I reached the cabin. The headlights swept across the trees and disappeared into darkness. Pine branches moved in the wind. The old porch creaked beneath my boots. Inside, the wood stove still held a faint glow. I placed my folder on the kitchen table and stared at the handwritten number copied from the binder. One line. 8 digits. Yet everyone in that clubhouse had gone silent when the surveyor read it aloud. That alone told me it mattered. I poured a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. The state archive database was not public, but I knew someone who had worked with it for years. His name was Daniel Mercer. We had crossed paths on several land access projects across the state. He knew boundary records better than almost anyone. I called him the next morning. The line rang twice. Then he answered. I read the reference number. Silence followed. Not confusion. Recognition. That was different. Where did you get that? He asked. I looked out the cabin window toward the ridge. Morning fog hung between the trees. That is a long story. Daniel did not laugh. Send me the number. Then he hung up. 3 hours passed. The waiting felt longer. I split firewood behind the cabin. I checked the water tank. I repaired a loose section of fence near the trail. Every few minutes I looked toward my phone. Nothing. Around noon the sky cleared. Sunlight broke through the pines and lit the hillside. Then my phone finally rang. Daniel again. This time his voice sounded completely different. Jack, I found the archive file. I sat down on the porch steps. Wind carried the smell of warm pine needles through the clearing. And another pause. Papers shuffled on his end. The boundary revision should never have been finalized. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. Daniel continued. The original state review had flagged multiple survey conflicts. Several markers did not align with the revised HOA map. The review remained unresolved for months. Then the file simply stopped. No final correction. No complete verification. No signed resolution. Just a revised boundary entering county records years later. I stared across the mountain. The trees looked exactly the same. The cabin looked exactly the same. Yet everything felt different now. Who approved it? I asked. That is the problem, Daniel replied. I cannot find a final approval signature. The words landed harder than I expected. State reviews always ended with signatures. Always. Without one, questions remained. Daniel sent copies of several archive pages to my email. I opened them immediately. Review notes. Survey comments. Marker discrepancies. Then one page stopped me cold. A handwritten annotation pointed toward a section of land near the Cedar Ridge entrance. The note warned that ownership could not be confirmed without additional field verification. I knew that location. Everyone did. It included the entrance road, the gatehouse, and the first section of community property. My phone buzzed again. This time it was the lead inspector. We need to meet tomorrow morning. His voice stayed calm. The state archive changed everything. Then he told me where to bring the documents. The meeting took place at the county survey office the next morning. The building sat on a hill overlooking the valley. Fog still lingered over the lower roads when I arrived. The parking lot was already half full. County trucks lined one side. State vehicles occupied the other. That alone told me this had grown beyond a simple complaint. I carried my survey tube inside. The hallway smelled like old paper, coffee, and printer toner. The lead inspector met me near a conference room. Several maps had already been pinned across the walls. Colored markers highlighted property lines. Survey coordinates covered white bars. The state surveyor stood beside a large aerial image of the mountain. Linda sat at the far end of the table. 2 board members were with her. Nobody looked comfortable. The meeting began quietly. The surveyor projected archive documents onto a screen. One page after another appeared. Original boundary filings. State review notes. Marker verification requests. Every document pointed toward the same unresolved issue. The disputed area near the Cedar Ridge entrance had never received final confirmation. The surveyor enlarged an aerial map. A red outline appeared across the image. Then he overlaid the original state survey. Several lines immediately shifted out of alignment. The room went silent. One board member leaned forward in his chair. Linda stared at the screen without speaking. The surveyor clicked again. Another layer appeared. This time the original survey markers lined up perfectly with my property records. He clicked once more. The revised HOA boundary moved nearly 60 feet in one section, then more in another. The lead inspector folded his arms. How long has this discrepancy existed? He asked. The surveyor checked the file dates. More than a decade. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Outside the conference room window, sunlight broke through the clouds and lit the valley below. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavier by the minute. The surveyor continued. He explained that the original review had identified the problem early. Additional field verification had been recommended. The recommendation remained incomplete. Yet the revised map somehow continued through later filings. The words were careful, professional, but the meaning was clear. Questions had been left unanswered. Then came the most important slide. The surveyor displayed an updated boundary reconstruction based on the original markers and state coordinates. The red lines shifted again. This time, everyone could see the impact immediately. The entrance road sat inside the disputed area. Part of the decorative fence crossed the line. Several landscaped sections did too. A murmur moved through the room. One board member lowered his head. Another rubbed his forehead. Linda finally spoke. "You are saying the map is wrong?" The surveyor answered calmly. "I am saying the original markers support a different boundary. The distinction mattered. Evidence mattered." The room understood that. The lead inspector turned toward me. "Your cabin was never the issue." Hearing those words out loud changed something. The complaint that started everything had almost disappeared from the discussion. Now every conversation revolved around boundaries, records, and ownership. The surveyor saved the final reconstruction and closed his laptop. Then he placed a new packet on the table. "We will need field verification at several locations." He paused briefly, including the gatehouse property. Linda looked down at the packet. Then she slowly turned the first page. Linda turned the first page slowly. The room remained quiet except for the soft sound of paper moving across the table. Sunlight reflected from the conference room windows and stretched across the maps pinned to the walls. The packet contained the proposed field verification plan. Survey points, marker locations, coordinate checks. Every item focused on the same section of land near the Cedar Ridge entrance. The surveyor explained the process carefully. Original markers would be located and verified. New measurements would be taken. State records would be compared against county filings. Then a final determination could be made. Nobody argued. At this stage, numbers mattered more than opinions. 2 days later, the field work began. The mountain air felt cool and clean. Pine needles covered the ground around the entrance road. County vehicles lined the shoulder. Survey crews moved between orange flags carrying tripods, measuring rods, and GPS equipment. Residents watched from sidewalks and driveways. Some brought folding chairs. Others stood beside golf carts. Word had spread through the entire community. I arrived just after sunrise. The lead inspector was already there reviewing the work schedule. The state surveyor stood beside one of the original markers uncovered earlier in the week. Dirt had been cleared away completely. The metal cap was visible now. The identification number matched the state archive records exactly. That was important. Very important. Throughout the morning, the crews collected measurements. Coordinates were called out and recorded. Stakes appeared across the landscape. Lines began forming where invisible boundaries had once existed only on paper. Around noon, the surveyor gathered everyone near the entrance road. A large map rested on the hood of a county truck. Fresh measurements had been added in red ink. The lead inspector compared the new data against the reconstruction created at the county office. Then he nodded. The numbers matched. A murmur spread through the crowd. The surveyor pointed toward the entrance lane, then toward the decorative fence, then toward the gatehouse. Every location fell inside the same highlighted area. Linda stood near the back of the group. She listened without interrupting. Several board members exchanged worried looks. One resident quietly asked another if the road itself might be affected. Nobody answered. The surveyor continued reviewing the findings. Additional verification points produced the same result. Marker after marker supported the original state survey. Marker after marker contradicted the revised boundary map. By late afternoon, the evidence had become difficult to ignore. The lead inspector closed his notebook and looked across the entrance property. Vehicles passed slowly through the gate. Residents stopped to watch. Wind moved through the pines above us. Then the surveyor revealed the final field summary. The entrance road was not the only feature inside the disputed area. Portions of the gatehouse property, several landscaped sections, utility easements, and part of the security infrastructure all extended into land that required ownership clarification. Silence settled over the crowd. The complaint against my cabin felt very far away now. The conversation had become something much larger. The surveyor carefully placed the summary packet into a folder and handed copies to the county officials. Then he announced the date of the formal review hearing. The formal review hearing took place 3 weeks later. Morning sunlight reflected from the county administration building as residents, board members, surveyors, and officials filed through the front doors. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain from a storm that had passed overnight. I carried the same survey tube that had sat on my cabin table for years. The lead inspector nodded when he saw me enter. Across the room, Linda sat with several HOA board members. Thick binders covered their table. Nobody looked confident anymore. The hearing began with a review of the original complaint. The county official summarized the allegations against my cabin. Then he reviewed the inspection findings. Permits, approvals, records. Every requirement had been satisfied. The complaint itself produced nothing. That part ended quickly. Then the discussion shifted to the boundary investigation. The room became noticeably quieter. Maps appeared on large screens. Survey photographs followed. State archive records filled the display. The state surveyor walked everyone through the timeline. Original markers, initial filings, unresolved review notes, later revisions, field verification results. Every step connected to the next. Every document supported the same conclusion. The revised boundary could not be fully supported by the original state survey data. Linda listened without interruption. Occasionally, she looked down at her notes. Most of the audience focused on the maps. The red and blue lines told the story more clearly than any speech could. The surveyor displayed the final reconstruction. Property lines shifted across the screen. The entrance road appeared inside the highlighted area. The gatehouse followed. Utility easements appeared next. Then sections of landscaping and security infrastructure. A low murmur moved through the audience. The county official allowed several questions. Residents asked about road access, utility maintenance, future corrections. The answers remained calm and practical. Nothing dramatic happened. No one raised their voice. The evidence did all the work. Eventually, the county official reviewed the final findings. The complaint against my cabin was dismissed. The original survey markers remained valid. The state archive records would be used for future boundary clarification. Additional review would determine how the affected HOA properties would be managed going forward. Then he closed the file. Just like that, the issue that started everything was over. I stepped outside after the hearing ended. Clouds drifted across the mountains in the distance. The parking lot buzzed with quiet conversations. Surveyors packed equipment into trucks. Residents gathered in small groups. Some looked relieved. Others looked exhausted. Linda exited the building a few minutes later. She paused near the sidewalk and looked toward the mountains. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she nodded once. Not agreement. Not friendship. Just acknowledgement. The situation had grown far beyond either of us. She walked toward her vehicle and drove away. I headed back toward the cabin. The road climbed through the pines exactly as it always had. The trees looked the same. The ridge looked the same. My cabin stood where it had stood before the complaint, before the inspections, before the hearings. Smoke drifted from the chimney into the afternoon sky. The old survey marker remained beside the pine stump. Quiet, unchanged, waiting where it had always been.